Finally, we should briefly talk about scope in the context of loops. As we said with conditionals, the scope of a variable is the area of the program's execution where the variable can be seen. In Python, a variable scope is effectively anything after the variable is created. It doesn't matter if it's declared inside a loop or inside a conditional or outside a loop. Anything after the variable is created is within the variable's scope. Now with conditionals, this presented a challenge if a variable was created inside a conditional, then referred to outside the conditional. If the conditional didn't run, which by design sometimes it wouldn't, then the variable was not created, and referring to it later would create an error. This isn't as big a deal in loops though. We rarely create loops that might not run at all. It can happen, but it isn't a common decision in my experience. However, loops create a different issue for creating variables inside loops. The first time you assign a value to a variable, Python creates the variable. Here, the variable sum doesn't exist until we set it equal to 0. But the second time it encounters an assignment operator acting on a variable, it just changes the variable's value. So sum equals 0 works for creating the variable sum and giving it its initial value of 0, and it also works for updating or resetting the value of sum. That means that if you create a variable inside a loop, then every time the loop runs, its value is replaced. Now many times it's perfectly fine. For example, in our number guessing game, we had one variable, userGuess, and its value was updated every time the user guessed a new number. We both created it and assigned it inside the loop, and that was perfectly fine because we never needed it outside the loop. However, if you're going to reference the variable outside of the loop, as we're doing here, then you're going to encounter a problem. The code will still run just fine, it just won't do what we expect. Unless we were just looking for the last value after a loop ran or something. Here, for example, we're trying to average the numbers that the user input, and yet every time this loop runs that gets the next number, sum is reset to 0. So when the loop runs the first time, sum is set to 0, next number becomes 91, because that's what the user inputted, and then sum is set equal to itself plus 91. And so right now the value of sum is 91. When the next run of this loop starts, execution then returns, finds that the user hasn't inputted all the numbers they want to input yet, and so the loop runs again. But the first thing that happens when the loop runs again is that sum is reset to 0. Then the user enters 92, and sum is set to itself plus 92, but remember, sum was just reset to 0. So now sum equals 0 plus 92, now sum just equals 92. Every time this loop runs, sum is first reset to the value 0. So when we get to the end, our sum is just the last value entered. In this case, that was 95, and 95 divided by 5 equals 19, when we can tell that the answer should be 93. We can avoid this by creating any variables that we're going to refer to after the loop outside of the loop. So here we create sum on line 2, and then we run our loop. That means that sum's value isn't reset every time the loop runs. Instead, we're just adding to it or updating it. And so when we reach the end, sum correctly equals 465, which divided by 5 equals 93. So my general advice, if you're going to need to use a variable after a loop, then don't define it inside the loop.